about the emergence of anthropology as an academic discipline in a context in which the prevailing sentiment was of racial determinism, unilinear social evolutionism, that the hierarchies, that the ethnocentric hierarchies of life were either given by nature or given to us by God. Anthropology comes onto the scene, makes a few mistakes, but eventually settles on the idea that that culture, what Benedict calls custom, traditions, these things, was really the source of what made people different, and that the individuals were first and foremost a product of their cultural heritage. Now, today, some people probably still need to hear this, but today this is probably widely accepted. At the time these folks were first coming out, they were seen as kind of these radical people, these revolutionaries. Boas, persecuted and despised. Lévi-Strauss was seen as kind of being on the edge of things. Mead, radical, making people weird. Ruth Benedict. They were really kind of on the outskirts, you might say, of American society. Many of them were themselves not very accepted, perhaps because they were immigrants or Jews or women. And so, they were fighting against the prevailing ideas of the time. But they were also fighting to become prestigious, for their academic positions. Now, for Mead and Benedict, this was also a fight because they were women and they were not allowed in academic halls of the time. It was very difficult to get an academic position, and Benedict really should have been the department chair much earlier than she was ever given that. And but they were also fighting against the economists and the physicists, in the sense that everybody seemed to be discovering these universal laws and have a lot of prestige, and anthropology was kind of the last one on the new kid on the block. And so they were trying to get in there, but they weren't really, they weren't as established as these other things, and they didn't seem to be, as able to pronounce with such authority as others. And so they were seeking to be experts on culture, but in the sense of they really got fastened upon what people would call primitive culture. Places that were small and didn't have the same kinds of stuff. And the idea was that in those places, and Benedict was very clear about this, that was like the laboratory of anthropologists. That all of these societies, if you could get to them faster than the missionaries and faster than the capitalists, that you could understand something about them and understand the kind of rich diversity of humankind. And so culture, although it was said to be what makes everybody human, really the anthropologists ended up focusing on these other societies. And I remember one of my professors, Sidney Mintz, some of you had to read a book by him in Latin America class. He was friends with Lévi-Strauss back in the day, but I think Mintz studied in Puerto Rico and in the Caribbean. And basically, when Lévi-Strauss learned that some of the people there had electricity, he just wasn't interested. in their society. It's like if they once they had electricity, it was like all over for him. It didn't matter anymore because he was really interested in this kind of pre-existing social life, which could be described before things happen. Now, I don't want to get too down on Lévi-Strauss because as one of my other professors, Michel Rolf Trujillo, who you'll read about, or you'll read a section of his coming up, talks about how Lévi-Strauss, perhaps more than any other anthropologist, did bridge the gap between what people in Europe and the US thought about people in other places. And the reason he bridged that gap was because he was basically proposing that the structures of the human mind were universal. So he wrote a book which was called in French, La Pensée Sauvage, which was unfortunately then translated into English at first as The Savage Mind. And so if you just looked at the title, you would think, oh, he's describing this mind of people who are other than us. But the whole point of the book was that actually the structures of the mind were the same across these societies. And so fortunately now it has been retranslated and retitled as Wild Thought, which was actually more what Lévi-Strauss was trying to get at when he was trying to get at the thought patterns of people that were, before we had all these electrical devices. What he would propose is that the human mind or the human thought has these universal structures. This is called structural analysis, French structuralism. And there were a number of people who participated in this, but Lévi-Strauss is perhaps the one who is most associated with it. And the idea here is that the universal structures of human thought come in a logical, and it's a logic of basically of a binary logic, of binary contrast between a positive and a negative. And if you can figure out that logic, that then it will be pretty much what you could do like what math and physics do. If you can figure out where the logical relationships are, then you can analyze whole societies and their kinship systems, and you can come up with all these wonderful ideas about them. So there's this great diagram that he includes in structural analysis, and it's described on this blog spot post, which is pretty cool. Basically, what he's saying here is that you have these. This was titled "The Problem of the Avunculate," and the avunculate refers to your mother's brother, or what we call in English an uncle. But in English, we don't distinguish between father's brother and mother's brother. But in many languages, this would be a key distinction between if you had an uncle on your mother's side or an uncle on your father's side. By the way, especially if you're matrilineal. What's your mother's brother going to be to you if you're in a matrilineal society? Huh? Yeah, in fact, in some cases, he might be the authority figure because you're getting your inheritance from your mother's son. And in some, what we might call extremely matrilineal societies, your mother's brother is the one who's going to be getting all the stuff that is important to you. That's where you're going to get stuff from. Your father is not that important. Your father belongs to a different lineage and might have other obligations to his own sister's children, who would be seen to be as, you see what I'm saying? So what he said is that in matrilineal societies, if there is a negative relationship within the pair bond of the parents, there they are up there. Laser pointer. Here we have the parents. What he said is, you have this negative relationship here, then there's going to be a positive relationship between sister and sister and uncle, or their sister brother, but uncle to, is all guys, by the way. As you can tell, he has a little bit of a guy thing, but you know, it's like that will be a positive relationship. In fact, that's always going to be a positive relationship. It has to be in a matrilineal society with your mother's brother. These negatives and positives just depend on where the other associations are within the family. And then he has a whole bunch of logic on the other side of the patrilineal relationships. There we go. When we use words, sometimes we're trying to think something, but we can't think it because we. So what he says here is that these relationships are going to be traced out in linguistics and in language. And that the reason we can't think about it is because it's not at the conscious level. It's in our subconscious or unconscious, and it's expressed. We don't even realize this. We don't even understand what's going on, and yet there it is, and expressed. And he says that if we can find out, if we can figure out how the language structures are correlated to the kinship structure in this sense, and you can get the binary oppositions going and get your charts going, have it all wrapped up, everything would be revealed. We'd be at the doorstep of figuring out all of life. He says it will be apparent, this is on page 84, in terms of our preceding discussion, that we are much closer to the understanding of the fundamental characteristics of social life than we have been accustomed to think. The idea was, man, we might not know what people are doing, but we're close. If we can figure this out, we might be really close to figuring it all out. And if we can figure all that out, then it's also going to correspond to the areas of art and mythology and religion. I mean, you know, the road will then be open for a comparative structural analysis of customs, institutions, and accepted patterns of behavior. Open road ahead. We will be in a position to understand basic similarities between forms of social life, such as language, art, law, religion, that on the surface seem to differ greatly. Anyway, that they're going to find that collective consciousness, and it's going to reveal these universal laws which make up the unconscious activity of the mind. It's hard for us in today's day and age to understand that, you know, this is like mind blown to people. People would come over in the 1960s with the newest book of Lévi-Strauss and be waving it around and be like, this is the future. I figured it all out. You know, all these, you know, he could bring in all these myths and things. You know, he'd take a myth, for example, and like I said, it's hard to recreate the excitement, but he'd take a myth that, you know, he had this whole analysis of a myth where there was somebody that was hungry and somebody that was rich, and then they were splitting up these berries. But then as the myth got closer to the point of origin, the story inverted, and he said it was like the optical analysis where, you know, when your eyes invert things, and you have this chart. It was mind-blowing stuff. And in fact, you can still find it today. And like, you know, on YouTube, people are like, oh, we can decode. We can figure out all the movies of the world with these binary opposites, and we can decode culture. So the thing about Lévi-Strauss and structuralism, as one of my friends put it once, you can sound brilliant like 95% of the time because you're revealing these things that don't even seem to be on the surface, and you're like binary oppositions, and you're analyzing all kinds of culture. It is not always the greatest, though, for understanding how people actually live their lives. So like I said, once people got electricity, started, you know, doing other things, Lévi-Strauss was the sort of the mythological level, the kinship level, that abstract level. It seemed to work, but did it really work on the basis of life? So we have already in our notes, right? We have this situation in which anthropologists are starting to become these experts on these primitive cultures, and we're revealing all these social laws and sounding all brilliant. But meanwhile, the so-called primitives had very different ideas about what they wanted to be doing with their lives. In fact, they may have wanted electricity. So we have here Jomo Kenyatta, who actually went over and for a while worked with Malinowski. Malinowski, apparently they became pretty close friends. In fact, he was a pretty anti-colonial kind of guy. And I mean, he ended up becoming perhaps what they called a conservative president, but he was hooked up with all these pretty radical groups at the time, trained in various places, and obviously has some pretty different ideas about what you were going to do with anthropology and what you were supposed to be doing in the world. Well, there were a couple surprising things, I think.
I think it was kind of like it almost felt like satire or something, like reading it and you're just like, oh yeah, this is exactly how it went. Like everyone can see that this is totally wrong and not how things should work.
Yeah, and the people, the man is the Africans, right? And all the animals are the European powers come in there. And then he just the man, as in the Africans, just what does he do? Just burns them down, sets the house on fire. Peace is costly, but it's worth the expense, and lived happily ever after. Wow, yeah, it's pretty intense, right? Yeah, no, it's like I said, they had different ideas about what they were going to be doing in the world, and it wasn't to be the fodder of Lévi-Strauss's structural analysis, and so a lot of people who went to do anthropology during this time were thinking they were going to record all these traditions and kinship systems and stuff, and people were burning down the house. I mean, it was revolutionary movement. So I mean, for me, this is kind of interesting because when I went to study graduate school for anthropology, of course you would read Lévi-Strauss. I mean, even if we don't necessarily agree with what he was writing all the time, it's still something that you have to read. And like I said, when you read what he did, it sounds brilliant like 95% of the time. Also, reading Malinowski's Kula Ring, the Argonauts of the Western Pacific, or Moos on the Gift is pretty mandatory reading if you want to be in anthropology. Those are things that you should know. I'm kind of reflecting upon at least my own training. We did not really read Ruth Benedict or Margaret Mead, at least in graduate school. So I read Lévi-Strauss, read Malinowski, read Marcel Mauss. But at least, what do you think this is? I mean, that's part of it, I think you can't rule out simple misogyny right off the bat. There's a couple other things too. Both Benedict or Mead were seen as popularizers. So they were seen as people who are like talking to the masses, right? More like, not novel writers, but kind of like the people who were supposed to do like the popular stuff. So they weren't seen as people who contributed to, say, the theory and the ideas behind and the methods of anthropology. They were seen more as those people who were, and in part it was, like I said, because it was difficult for them to get formal academic traditions and or positions. I also think perhaps it was just assumed that you had already read Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead when you were in college and before you went to graduate school, you should have already read those because they were, you know, more basic for you. But some people hadn't yet. They were history majors like me. Kenyatta is, you know, to tell you the truth, before I read this, I had not even realized that he was trained as an anthropologist. As our editors say in their introduction to this section, that the rest of these people do get read still, but Kenyatta has been largely been erased from the Western canon altogether. As to say, you wouldn't read him in anthropology or maybe at all. So I think it's good that they include him in here and do this. So I think what I'm getting at, and we talked about this before, is that there's a kind of a good comparison here between, say, Zora Neale Hurston's work and the things, say, Franz Boas or some of the people that Hurston was associated with. And we saw Clint Smith talk about Zora Neale Hurston's training as an anthropologist. And on the one hand, anthropology was pretty radical and revolutionary at the time, but on the other hand, they were not embracing of a Zora Neale Hurston or a Jomo Kenyatta. And I wonder what might have happened if they had embraced that. Yeah, I mean, I think that
It's probably right. The West doesn't want to like normalize the idea of revolutions.
right. I would say that in some ways, like Zora Neale Hurston, right, his depiction of Africans and in Zora Neale Hurston's case, African Americans and the African diaspora is much more complex than what people wanted to accept, right? So people are willing to accept certain stereotypes and they're willing to accept certain ideas, but yeah, either politically, you don't want to endorse something like that, or you know, in the case of Zora Neale Hurston, the fact that people they weren't necessarily noble, as Clint Smith says, and people didn't like that idea. It was too down to earth. It was too earthy. And so, yeah, I mean, that kind of true radicalism, I think people don't want to accept it. And so, you know, when there are instances in history of, you know, people banding together, they often then get written out of history and forgotten because it's like, no, we don't want to do that. Yeah, I would say so. I think that's definitely part of it, for sure. For sure. I mean, when you read about some of the groups that Kenyatta was associated with, you're like, whoa, that's intense, right? So, you know, but like you quoted, you can fool people for a time, but not forever. So I wonder what would have happened if they had embraced these people more in the past. And I wonder who we would embrace now. Who are the voices that we would need to hear now that we are not necessarily hearing? Did you know, though, she was an anthropology major? That's right.